Guitar Co-op Podcasts. Great Composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon. What is charisma or star quality in a composition? The composer of the month in the GuitarCoop podcast is Agustín Barrios, and his music undeniably has charisma. As a musician, I might find that some of his music is not the very best in compositional terms, technically speaking, but there is something that really resonates with the listeners to such an extent that today he's one of the most popular and beloved guitar composers. Agustín Barrios. Barrios was born in 1885 in war-torn Paraguay, where classical music culture was scarce, and he managed through his exceptional talent and artistic strength to become one of the most significant composers in guitar history and a guitarist of extraordinary resources. Barrios was one of 8 children in a family with artistic inclinations. He began studying music at a very young age, and his first teacher was Gustavo Sosa Escalada, who taught him the classics like Sor, Tárrega, and Aguado. Escalada was probably the major guitar teacher in Paraguay at the time. At age 13, Agustín was already recognized as a prodigy and won a scholarship to the Colegio Nacional in Asunción. At the same time, he received musical training with a band conductor. After finishing his studies, he embarked in a musical career, and in 1910, at the age of 25, we find him in Argentina, where he made his first recordings. By the way, Agustín Barrios is possibly one of the very first guitarists to make recordings, certainly the first prominent guitarist to make recordings in a time where technical conditions were very, very incipient. During this period, he must have met and perhaps even studied with Jiménez Manjón, the famous blind Spanish guitarist, and perhaps with Miguel Llobet, the famed Spanish guitarist as well. After brief periods in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, in 1916 we find Barrios in Brazil, where he remained for 6 years and enjoyed unprecedented success. Today, in a time when guitar recitals can be seen as a part of the regular concert life, it is difficult to imagine the difficulties and the opposition that Barrios had to face. Paraguayan of Indian descent, playing an instrument of dubious reputation, and to which no one attributed the ability to sustain a musical argument. That was the entrepreneurial character of Barrios' art. Barrios' concerts in Brazil, in fact, marked a turning point in the reputation of the guitar itself on the Brazilian stage and of South America at large. In the 1910s, his concerts in venues like the São Paulo Opera House or the Old Conservatory received the first positive reviews regarding the guitar in our press. For the first time, a biased critic had to surrender to the guitar's ability to produce a full musical experience. Such was the artistic power of Barrios' concerts. Barrios tried to return to Paraguay, but when he tried to make a farewell concert, his access to the main theater was denied for political reasons. So he just sat at a bench on the main square and attracted people to watch to his open-air concert. After that, he moved back to Brazil, the scenario of his greatest success, and lived there until 1932. He never returned to Paraguay after this. It was a period that marked the heyday of Barrios' guitar and when he composed many of his best-known works. Barrios led the romantic life of a bohemian artist, intoxicated by his art and in communion with his audience. This is a very accurate portrayal of the path that he chose for his life in this mature period of his career. He visited most of the Brazilian states, playing in every city, large or small, without any prior knowledge of the level of musical culture of his audiences. There is a delightful story that was told to me by the guitarist Marcelo Caiat. In the 1980s, Marcelo was traveling in the Amazonian state of Pará for a series of concerts that was promoted by the local State Department of Culture, which included not only the capital, which is a very large and cultural city, but also several villages in the countryside, in the hinterland, some of which were of very difficult access. Sometimes you had to travel by plane and to land over a river and have still a long trip on boat. And when Marcelo arrived to one of those places, could be better described as a village. Marcelo just arrived there, and there was a church and a small school where he was supposed to play, and he just thought of himself, wow, I must be the first classical guitarist to play here, perhaps even the first musician. And at the end of the concert, an elderly gentleman just came and told him that that was not the case, because he had heard the great Agustín Barrios play in the same venue back in the 1930s. From 1930 onwards, Barrios decided to go for a complete makeover, embracing his indigenous roots and advertising his concerts as the Paganini of the Paraguayan jungles, Chief Nitsuga Mangoré. Nitsuga is Agustín spelled backwards. And he presented himself and published publicity photos in which we see him in a completely indigenous costume, complete with loincloth and a headdress, and of a very dubious authenticity, to say the least. With this new format, Barrios took his show to many Latin American countries, starting with Venezuela. On the eve of World War II, he briefly visited Belgium, Spain, and Germany, and upon returning to Guatemala, apparently he suffered a heart attack that ended his dreams of conquering the United States. Unable to continue his bohemian life, Barrios settled in El Salvador at the invitation of the president himself. There he taught at the conservatory in the capital, and in El Salvador he died in 1944. Later on, there was a major dispute between El Salvador and Paraguay over Barrios' remains. Paraguay actually requested his remains to be repatriated. But the fact is that Barrios never returned to Paraguay. He felt ostracized by his own country, and apparently his remains are still in El Salvador. At the time of Barrios, the guitar repertoire was very scarce. I mean, the art of transcription was still not very developed. We had not incorporated the lute works into our repertoire, and artists such as Tárrega, Llobet, and the young Segovia were creating a medley of romantic transcriptions, works of their own composition, and short pieces. Access to new works was still very limited, and serious composition by composers who didn't play the guitar only started to appear in the mid-1920s. Barrios solved that problem in the most pragmatic way. He composed music in all styles. We can compartmentalize Barrios' output as a composer of almost 200 pieces into 4 categories. The first is the works inspired by folklore and local dances of Latin America, such as the pericón, machixe, cueca, and danza paraguaya. The second category is the pastiche of early music, minuets, gavottes, and arias in which he imitates the style of composers such as Bach or Mozart, or of Spanish dances, and thus he fills an uncomfortable gap in the repertoire of his time. I can even say that pastiche is the right term because Barrios lacks that kind of farcical or commercial intention. Perhaps it would be better to describe it as synchronicity. He is a 19th century composer transposed or transplanted into the 20th century and without feeling any inadequacy for it. One of his best-known works, La Catedral, belongs to this category of music in the manner of, which suggests the intensity of his personal experience. Barrios was in Montevideo, capital of Uruguay, and he went to visit the main cathedral of San Jose, where an organ player was practicing a Bach chorale. That solemn music transported the composer to a spiritual dimension. And after this epiphany, he just walked to the street only to feel the contrast with the prosaic hubbub, the agitation and the futility of earthly life. The duality between this religious experience and the profanity is represented by the two contrasting parts of La Catedral. The third category is that of characteristic pieces of romantic inspirations. Perhaps that is where we find the true Barrios. This is the bohemian, the bold Barrios, who recited passages from Don Quixote and 1001 Nights from memory. The Barrios who was a master of calligraphy and author of several poems, and who could draw portraits of beautiful young ladies to perfection. The Barrios who spoke languages. In short, the poet of the guitar in the tradition of the popular intellectual that we still see so present in Latin American countries. These works have varied themes, some with sentimental themes actually, others are religious, historical, or evocative, and each one has a kind of unique inspiration. Barrios at that time supposedly played on steel strings. Several reasons are invoked for this characteristic. Certainly there are no gut strings produced in South America, and they could be very expensive, and the access might be very hard as well. So what people say is that Barrios would play with steel strings and put a piece of rubber underneath the tie point, so he would make the sound of the guitar less strident with that expedient. But that is all speculation, and I find it very hard to confirm this proposition just by listening to his recordings. The fourth category is that of works of a technical nature, concert studies. Sometimes they are very intricate and exhausting to play, and sometimes they are poetic and evocative like La Catedral. They are a mix of exercise and a characteristic piece. One of his specialties was the tremolo effect. He left several works in this style, and we just have to listen to this contemplación to soon realize why. Personally, I'm much more interested in Barrios' music, his artistic personality, and the fabulous guitarist he was, an original who must be studied by anyone interested in historical interpretations on the guitar. The problem is that the biographical and social-cultural factors, as well as political issues and the very reception of his works, have affected and distorted the way we listen to and understand Agustín Barrios. I can't think of any other guitar composer who has suffered a similar phenomenon. Perhaps in musical history, someone like Shostakovich is always read in opposition to the biographical data, but in the guitar thing, Barrios is a unique phenomenon. There is a trouble surrounding Barrios. There are controversies. There is a fictionalized, exaggerated, and falsified biographical data. The first of these disputes is due precisely to the fact that Barrios is possibly Paraguay's most famous artist. Apart from a couple of top models like Johanna Benitez and a few soccer players, there are no Paraguayan artists who are recognized worldwide, not even pop singers. Barrios entered classical music history in a practice that is truly international. This made him a strategic figure in Paraguay's cultural policy. Everybody there reveres his memory, his music is heard in media, his face is on the Paraguayan currency banknotes. This creates a narrative that is all the more established the more it resonates with officialdom, something that is very strong in many South American countries. A new character was born in the world of guitar. That is the Mangorean, the expert in Barrios' music and biography. The Mangoré specialist is the one who is absolutely fascinated by the music and the character of Barrios, and whose work is validated by the authorities the more Barrios appears as a quasi-saint, a person with a pure heart, wronged and persecuted from all sides. Many of these scholars have had a precarious musical background and even less solid academic criteria. Some of the published biographies are heroic, in fact, because they have been financed by the author's own pockets, who had to investigate private archives in several countries in South America. One of them was even arrested in Paraguay when he tried to sell some of Barrios' manuscripts, because any Barrios memorabilia is treated by his country as cultural heritage. His biographical data and nuances of how he thought, how he acted, and how he dealt with his private life lack continuous narrative from reliable sources. Correspondence, newspaper articles, reports from serious diarists, much of the narrative emerged from conversations people who many times only knew him in passing or had unreliable accounts from his students. Well, it's gossip, in short. This creates a biased scenario in which information is always colored by sympathy or antipathy for the composer. This happens to practically anyone who has died, but in the case of Barrios, it's almost of a matter of state. One example of an almost insoluble controversy is the relationship between Barrios and Andrés Segovia, the most famous guitarist in the 20th century. All my life I have heard the story that Segovia had deliberately harmed Barrios' career, actively working against him. Every time I argued that there were no concrete facts to support this claim, someone came along and say, "Oh, you know nothing. So-and-so told me this. So-and-so told me that. So-and-so is hiding the fact to protect Segovia," and so on and so forth. What can be said is that the two met in Buenos Aires, that Barrios wrote to a friend saying that Segovia had been friendly and receptive, and that he had asked for a copy of La Catedral, which Barrios provided. Segovia's account of the same encounter says that he never received a copy of Barrios' music, and he felt a bit strange because of that. After that, everything seems to be gossip. When asked publicly what he thought of Barrios, Segovia responded in different ways, always suggesting that Barrios was his own enemy. Barrios, for his part, is said to have said that Segovia was deaf at heart. From the point of view of the Mangoré specialists, Barrios' music was supposedly so incredible that Segovia was obliged to play it. More than that, he would have to recognize Barrios' superiority as a guitarist as well and help him to get concerts in Europe. This is such a completely absurd proposition, even more so in the early 20s when Segovia was still not such a famous name worldwide. Segovia was also a good composer, and he did not even play or record his works but one. Why on earth would he have been obliged to play anyone else's music? But for the Mangoré scholars, this is a huge character flaw. The problem is that this stupidity even contaminates Wikipedia entries about Barrios, which says that Segovia did not play Barrios out of professional envy, since Barrios was supposedly a better composer and guitarist than he was. Another issue in Barrios' biography is that of his relationship with his wife. His wife, Gloria, was a Brazilian Afro-descendant lady, and supposedly that would have posed an impediment for him to enter the United States due to racial issues. Well, biographies ooze their misogyny between the lines. One biography, without knowing enough about Gloria, says that she was a great cook. It would have been much better not to say anything, then, isn't it? It seems that no one knows exactly what brought Barrios and Gloria together. But all this hides sensibly more serious issues. We know that Barrios entered Puerto Rico, which was then U.S. territory, traveling with a diplomatic passport. A couple of years later, a source says that Barrios had a heart attack in front of the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala when it was discovered that he was presenting a false diplomatic passport. Could this, combined with the fact that he had recently been to Nazi Germany, have been the reason for his subsequent refusal to enter the U.S.? Was he really asked to leave Guatemala after that for carrying a false passport? Why on earth did he have a false passport? Another serious issue is recounted in one of the biographies. Forensic examination of Barrios' body suggests that he may have died of poisoning. In El Salvador, his wife Gloria was apparently having an affair with the Italian Pasquale Cosarelli, who was a coffee plantation owner and shared a house with the couple. Gloria apparently married Cosarelli shortly after Barrios' death. I find all of that plausible, but there is also a complete lack of supporting documentation. Another issue regarding Barrios is the history of the reception of his music. All the best-known historians claim that his music was forgotten after his death, until the great guitarist John Williams recorded his music in 1978 and put his name back on the musical map. Since then, of course, his music has become a favorite among guitarists around the world. I also have to make a claim for the Salvadorian musicologist and guitarist and composer Carlos Payet, who provided copies of Barrios' music for John Williams. Barrios and all of us who like his music have only to thank John Williams, and that is a given. This recording was circulated worldwide and coincided with the republication of his music. But Barrios has never stopped being played. His music was published in Brazil in the 30s and 40s by Isaías Savio. La Catedral had several editions at the time. The Paraguayan guitarist Sila Godoy toured in the 1950s playing exclusively Barrios music and even attended Segovia classes in Spain playing Barrios music. Brazilian guitarists Laurindo Almeida, Geraldo Ribeiro, and Barbosa Lima, and the Venezuelan guitarist Alirio Diaz all played Barrios in the 1950s and 60s. There was no composer to be rediscovered. There was a continent, America, to which no one paid due attention in musical culture. And this attention outside the Americas, yes, that is due to John Williams' recording. He first and foremost rescued in Europe and the United States a composer who was perhaps little known but certainly discriminated against due to his origins and to the hybrid nature of his music. I will contribute here to the thick file of myth and hearsay that circulates around the name of Barrios. And let me make a disclaimer here, because this is all speculation without any solid factual basis. Could it be that the native Indian costumes, which had little or nothing to do with authentic Indian costumes, were a cover-up for his desire to cross-dress? In many of the photos in which he appears in native Indian costumes, he's heavily made up. Of course, because these were publicity photos and the makeup may have been a mere technical necessity. But the fact is that in many of those pictures, he presents a kind of feminine appearance. This is in line with rumors that have circulated in Brazil, especially in Rio de Janeiro, that he may have had hidden homosexual relationships. Some of the rumors point to the great Brazilian guitarist and composer João Pernambuco as a possible partner, since they shared the same house for some time. Could this be that the relationship between Barrios and Gloria was a sham marriage? We will never know unless we can find reliable documentation about that. Other observers point to the thinning of Barrios' lips, which was supposedly the result of plastic surgery in order to disguise his indigenous origins. This seems quite contradictory and unlikely to me, especially after he created the character of the chief Nitsuga Mangoré. He was not ashamed of his Indian heritage after all. False passports, closeted lives, murder, all of this, in my opinion, points to the fact that both Barrios' music and his biography still need a lot, but a lot of research, which benefits from academic criteria and funding. For those who want to know more about Barrios, naturally, the most complete biography to date is 6 Silver Moonbeams by Richard Stover, which should be read, in my opinion, with a good dose of skepticism regarding what is not documented. To learn more about Barrios' activity in Brazil, Ciro Del Vizio's book, Agustín Barrios in the Land of Dreams, is a must-read. Unfortunately, it's only available in Portuguese, and just a tip, I think it should be translated at least to English and Spanish. what about Barrios the guitarist? To me, it's a great paradox. Mangoré lovers and amateur guitarists consider Barrios one of the most technically challenging composers of all time and always emphasize that condition. I find his music not too difficult, not too easy, quite organic, enjoyable to play, and only in certain moments does he present extreme difficulties, especially those related to resilience in fast passages and stretches. For me, the greatest difficulty with Barrios' music is capturing it. His style escapes us. He has the hands of a concert pianist with the soul of a rhapsode. He requires a lot of practice, but he suffers from an overly premeditated interpretation. Even some guitars seem to refuse to sing his music well, which does not sound good on any kind of instrument. As a result, many of the great virtuosos in history have made very unconvincing recordings of his music. It's not enough to play Barrios. We have to live Barrios. The starting point is Barrios himself. In a good remastering, it becomes clear that he was not as refined as a guitarist as Segovia by a long shot, but his energy and eloquence, seasoned with an absolutely irrepressible sincerity of expression, more than make up for the technical roughness. Although the recordings often sound uncontrolled and overly sugary to modern ears, one can only marvel at the extraordinary imagination. Let's listen, for example, to the beautiful Waltz No. 4, where the recurring melodic figure is pronounced with a different inflection at each repetition, sometimes melancholy, sometimes faster and more nervous, sometimes more measured and dignified, but always maintaining a beautiful waltz rhythm and an atmosphere of deep sadness. The central section especially is pure magic and lightness. It's a true fairy dance. To me, this is one of the most beautiful recordings in history. I'll give a summary to guitar students. Without studying Barrios' recordings in detail, you will never be able to play his music well. recordings are just as much a primary source as a manuscript or a photo in this case. Next, we have the generation that followed the composer himself. I'll only talk about the guitarists who move me, who I find truly extraordinary. I'll start with the recently deceased Paraguayan Cayo Sila Godoy, who is practically a direct link to Barrios. His interpretations show a surprisingly good technique, and the style flows from his fingers. Next in order is the great Brazilian Geraldo Ribeiro. Geraldo seems like a reincarnation of Barrios. His sorrows and sufferings as an artist find an echo in Barrios' deep sensitivity, and many consider his recordings to be the highest reference in Barrios' interpretation. It is the perfect adaptation of the technique to Barrios' expressive universe. I like very much the interpretations of the Venezuelan Alirio Diaz, who was one of the great promoters of Barrios' work. Alirio is a more modern guitarist, but he comes from a tradition of the Venezuelan popular guitar. That is why his recordings of works of a more folkloric nature are mandatory. Another one I really like is the Peruvian Jesus Castro Balbi. He's not a well-known guitarist, and I know very little about him, but I would put him side by side with Godoy and Ribeiro. It's one of the best CDs entirely dedicated to the music of Barrios. We will never be sufficiently grateful to John Williams, one of the great guitarists in history, for having believed in Barrios' music and spreading it around the world in 4 decades of concerts. His sonority, which is perhaps a bit clinical and impersonal, is not what moves me the most in this kind of music, but his enthusiasm for the discovery is palpable, and his technique is something to listen to on your knees. Brazilian Marcelo Caiat has made several recordings of Barrios and has managed to maintain the micro-expression that reacts to his aesthetic world, while the performance meets the highest technical standards of the modern guitar. If you like to listen to clean, virtuoso guitar, but still with that warmth, Marcelo is your Barrios player. The Scotsman Dave Russell does not seem to be an obvious match to Barrios' music. He is a crystal clear, balanced interpreter without extremes of emotion or concessions to the popular taste, perhaps precisely because he brings this kind of independent vision of the music. He is fascinating in his own terms. If you like your Barrios treated like a true classical composer, David is your guitarist. The one who is recognized today as the greatest authority on Barrios' music is the Paraguayan guitarist Berta Rojas. The interesting thing is that she's a very objective, attentive guitarist. She reads the text with care without exaggeration or sentimentality, but still she is extremely persuasive in the music of her compatriot. Italian guitarist Cristiano Porquedo, has recorded the most completely complete recording of Barrios' works to date. That is not an easy deed because since much of his music has been rediscovered in the last few decades, one has to compile new editions to produce a complete recording. He has an admirable technical fluency and managed to bring variety to a complete works that, by its very own nature, is a bit repetitive. And of course, all the artists who have recorded Barrios for GuitarCoop are part of this select group of great Barrios performers. To hear the super original interpretations, I recommend that you go to your favorite streaming platform and listen to the playlist that we have prepared exclusively for you, which contains recordings by Glober Rocha, Edson Lopez, Anabel Montesinos, and Zoran Dukic. I hope you have enjoyed this episode and invite you to listen to next month's episode, which will focus on Napoleon Cost. I would like to thank Henrique Caldas for the technical work. See ya! Guitar Co-op Podcasts. Great composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon.